Now, so Hailey, we've been Instagram friends and talk occasionally, and then I saw a recent post that you had about 1 in 4 runners suffer from a eating disorder. And I know Jen, she's has some coaching topics that she's been wanting to talk about, and I was like, wow, you know what? this probably meshes up pretty well. Rather than just having Jen and I talk about it, we can bring someone else that has some insight. So for those that don't know, Alyssa, I'll let you do I'm sure you knew we were going to have you do a brief intro of yourself. So I hope you're prepared. So here's Hailey Fisher.
Yeah, so I'm a licensed professional counselor, and I specialize in working with athletes, particularly athletes with eating disorders. And so that has been what I've been trained to do, is work with, well, specifically with eating disorders. And then I was a college athlete. I went to school on a D1 college cross country and track scholarship. And I myself suffered from an eating disorder in high school and in college. And so I really have a heart for those suffering, especially being in the D1 scene and seeing, just how prevalent it was and how there was not a lot of help. And that is, there's a lot of people who's trained to work with like sports performance skills. And there's a lot of people who are trained to work with eating disorders, and not very many who are trained to work with both. And so that is a big gap. And that was a place that I really wanted to fill because I saw a need for it.
Oh, that's awesome. So this is just off the cuff, but I guess I'm sure you've seen the news about the whole Oregon and the DEXA scan, the most recent blasphemy against, I think it was said that they're doing it for all their athletes, but I think only the female track athletes were the ones that were like being put on their little specific dietary plans, and being given that that target BMI to work for. What were your thoughts about that?
Not surprised. The college program I was in had a very similar operation that was going on for particularly the cross country team. And then I've worked with a lot of athletes that have very other similar programs happening. There's a local school that when you walk into their dining hall, they've got the color planned of meal plans that their coach gets to decide which one they get put on. And that's what they're supposed to do. It would maintain, lose, or gain weight. And the cafeteria workers can't serve them any more than what their color coded plan is. And so, it's like horrific, but it's also not surprising because I see it all the time. That's the feedback I get all the time, like from athletes.
Yeah.
And so
it's definitely still prevalent. My daughter plays volleyball, and there is a coach in our region, and he is the sought after coach. Like he wins, but he portions out his athletes' food and makes comments like, well, if you didn't eat at McDonald's all the time, you would jump higher. And first of all, I would never consider letting my daughter play for anyone that acted like that. And as we go on college visits, if they're not talking about, I notice the things that they have in the locker rooms, what they tell, and I notice the things that are in the coaches' offices. And I've straight up asked them about their views on food, just because I really don't want my daughter to end up in a restrictive program like that, because it's so damaging. And we actually have had a teammate who kind of ended up finding herself in an eating disorder just because, that was the only thing that she felt like she could control in her life at that point. And anyway, it's a passion of mine. I get really wound up about it.
Yeah, well, good for you for asking. Like, going into college, like I didn't know what kind of questions I should be asking, which I was also like in the middle of my eating disorder, but like good for you for knowing like questions to ask, because that's super important, like to be trying to figure out like what's the culture of this team. Because I will also say, like, one of the other sports that I see, which like normally we think of, typically they say like ball or team sports don't have as many eating disorders, but at the college level, I see a lot of athletes who play volleyball with eating disorders that.
Volleyball is another body image sport because you're out there playing in spandex.
Right.
And you're supposed to be tall and skinny. So it's definitely, I think there's definitely a pressure. And then, I know a lot of people think that it's all about body image, but it really is more about control. And so, if you don't feel like you have control over anything else in your life, then you start controlling your food. And the way that our friend, she started she just started trying to clean up her diet when COVID started. And then she started doing a little bit more exercise at home. Like she would just do crunches when they were watching TV, or, push-ups during commercials. And so, how you feel initially, you have that burst of energy and you feel so much better. And then when that initial burst of energy was gone, then it was like more restrict to try to get back to that place. And it's just a really scary place for people to be.
Yeah. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because like I would say 100% of the people I see in my office, that's how their eating disorder starts, right? Like it starts from good intentions of I want to excel like athletically, or I want to focus on my health or something of that nature. And unfortunately, we really lack as a culture a lot of like real scientific facts about diet and nutrition and biology, right? And what people don't understand is that there are some athletes that can manipulate food for a season and they could snap right back out of it, right? And they could do it and be fine. And for other people, they're wired differently, and that really flips a switch for them. And they start that ball rolling, and their biology and their neurobiology starts changing, right? And so the serotonin and the different receptors in their brain start changing differently. And so they can't just flip the switch again, right? Like they're on a pathway that is very difficult, which is also part of what makes eating disorders so hard to treat, is that we're looking at both the mental health and the physical health illness that has changed the biology and neurology of somebody's brain and body. And so we're trying to treat all these multifaceted approaches, and you really need a team. And they've got all these other messages, right? Like but that's not healthy. And that's not true. Like most of coaches who are giving nutrition advice are like outside of like their specialty of what they can be actually recommending.
Right. Yes. Well, we have a lot of Instagram heroes, don't we? Peddling a lot of bad information.
We do, and the thing that I like to tell people, about like anybody you follow on Instagram, especially if they're giving nutrition information, is like if they're giving, mental health information or whatever information, is like to do a background search on them, like just figure out like what their credentials are, like what they've done. There's a recent study that I like to bring up that they took a bunch of fitness influencers from Instagram, and they had them do a poll, and they had them take like an eating disorder assessment, and they did blood work. And these people thought they were going to come back healthy, and they came back scoring like in the concern for eating disorder, and their blood work came back showing that they were medically compromised.
Oh my God.
And so I like to tell people that I see in my office, like, that was, I believe it was like 80 to 90% of the influencers like within that study. And so that's a very high percent. And those people, like, they really believed that they were doing something right. Like they weren't trying to like give people faulty information. They themselves thought they were healthy until they took joined this study and realized like, no, you're not healthy.
Wow. That's incredible. That is really incredible.
Yeah.
So hold on. So how do you, because once you get into that, like, I mean, well, so, carbs and fat are bad. Like that's the message that diet culture is telling us. How do we learn how to balance those messages from diet culture? How do we learn how to block those out and not be afraid of carbs and fat?
Yeah, so anytime anybody comes into my office with eating issues, like I always recommend they go see a dietitian, which actually, like when somebody isn't an athlete, they really love me and they really don't like their dietitian. And when somebody is an athlete, like the athletic culture is really like, oh, like nutrition will help you and mental health will not help you, right? So they're usually really excited to go see the dietitian and they don't particularly want to see me. But I always recommend, I'm like, even if you just go once or twice, like into a dietitian, because they can give you some science, right? And they can give you not like, this is exactly what you need to be eating, but a guideline of like, hey, this is what would actually be like adequate, like if you filled in these spaces. And so I think for a lot of people, they really like they don't understand the science behind like, oh, carbs are like what my body is going to run off of, right? It's going to be easier for my body to run X amount of miles if I'm giving it carbs and simple carbs that are more like sugary and like easier to break down than if I'm giving it protein, because yes, it can break protein down into carbs, but it's a whole nother process. And so I'm wasting energy to do that. And it's probably also going to upset my stomach more than just having some of these other things. And oftentimes people just don't, I think, understand the science behind it. And so I always recommend like that they have somebody explain the science to them. And then as far as like blocking out the messages, it really, I think, comes down to like doing the work of like my own convictions, like testing the science. So I tell people like, hey, just do what your ass could do for like 2 weeks. 2 weeks isn't going to hurt you. Let's see if it's as bad as you think it is. And if it's not, like, let's keep doing it. If it's as bad as you think it is, like, we can stop doing it, right? But like, can you go all in for a couple of weeks and see how it is? And so I really like people to test and to gather data while they're testing about like, so if I eat more carbs, if I eat more fat, like, how do I feel? Like, so they're tracking and writing down, like, how did I feel on my run today? As opposed to how was I feeling before? And then we have like data points to look back and say like, okay, well, what is my experience and how is my experience lining up against like these messages that I'm getting?
Oh, that's really good. Let's see, sorry. Okay, so you're more on the counseling side rather than and so when you see someone in your office, are they usually in a full-blown eating disorder, or do you deal with a lot of disordered eating type behaviors before they get to that point of just that hormonal cascade?
Yeah, no, most of the time when somebody finally ends up in my office, they're in a full-blown eating disorder. Very rarely do I see anybody who's in disordered eating. Like, and so most of the clients that come into my office, like it's a pretty long road that we have to walk together. And that really matches up with like the statistics. They say like 75% of people with eating disorders don't seek treatment. A lot of the time, by the time somebody seeks treatment from me, if they're an adolescent, it's like, they've lost their period and their parents have like started to notice like, hey, like that's not really normal, or like people are commenting that you don't look healthy. And if they're an adult, they've really probably almost always hit like a very scary point where something physically scary has happened to them, and which that they've decided, or somebody around them has told them they need to seek treatment.
Yeah. Do you like, it seems to me like most of the time those eating, like from what I've read, in an adolescent, it's usually around that 15 or 16 a lot of times. Does that how it plays out in your practice, or are you seeing?
So I would say no, not necessarily anymore. So I've also worked in like higher levels of care, so not just outpatient. which I don't work in higher level of care anymore. But I would say that it typically starts a little bit earlier, more around like middle school for a lot of kids. Yet they usually don't come into the office till around 15 or 16.
Gotcha.
Or later. But I mean, for a lot of the individuals that I see that are coming into the office, you know, they talk about disordered teenagers, particularly, they talk about disordered behaviors that they can remember starting in like first grade.
Well, I think, I mean, you know, a lot of our attitude toward food is, I mean, we learn that as kids. And I mean, I know, like, I've always kind of had a little bit of a body image, you know, I mean, I don't know very many women that don't have body image issues in the United States, but I just, you know, thinking back about it, my mom would make comments about her body, like negative comments about her body. And I realized, you know, as I became an adult, that probably shaped my own view about my body. I've tried really hard not to do that in front of my kids. My youngest daughter was just a little bit heavy when she was a preteen. And she's seen pictures of herself and asked me why I didn't put her on a diet. And I was like, there was no way I was ever going to do that. Like, because I was so careful about just things that I said about food, because I didn't want her to develop bad habits or develop an eating disorder down the road. And I mean, she's very strong, and I mean, you know, she lost some weight when she went through a growth spurt, but I just was very adamant that I wasn't going to put that onto her. Yeah, I mean, I still kind of deal with it a little bit here and there. It's just, and it's hard. And then, you know, carbs are bad. Everybody thinks carbs are bad.
I love carbs.
I love carbs too, but then I have to be like, it's okay to eat the pasta, Jen. Like, it's okay to eat. I make myself eat pasta and rice and all the stuff that, you know, I'm not going to eat cauliflower rice. I just refuse.
Yeah, neither am I. You know, like what you're saying, I always explain to people like disordered eating and even like disordered exercise behavior, because they often go together, right? They exist on this spectrum, and you've got two extremes of a spectrum, right? Like we've got not eating, we've got binge eating, our excessive eating that's like out of control, that's like emotional and is a mental is something that's mentally going on, right? And then you've got also the extremes of exercise where you're like high intensity over exercising, and then you've got somebody who, even though we do know that it's healthy for us to get out and move our bodies and walk and to do something joyful and to have movement in our life, that they don't do any of that, right? And so there are these two ends of the spectrum, and all of us exist on that spectrum, and we don't have to stay in the same place, right? And like we move up and down it, everybody does. It's as we start to get closer and closer to an end of that spectrum where behaviors become more of an issue and a problem. And so even like somebody who wouldn't say that they have an eating disorder, I would expect them to have body image issues. I would expect them at times to question like what they're eating, like, because that's part of the human experience, is that we have this kind of broken relationship with our bodies and with movement and with food.
Yeah, that's good. So how do you recommend coaches approach athletes if a coach suspects that their athlete may be dealing with some disordered eating?
Yeah. So always I recommend that coaches address it, right? Because I think sometimes coaches think like they're scared to, like, it's especially I know male coaches, like I talked with a lot of male coaches, and male coaches are very, very anxious to approach that topic oftentimes. But when you don't say anything, it speaks louder than when you say something, right? And so I always say like, let's, and I think also coaches tend to sometimes have a fear that they maybe aren't like, they've done polls and like studies, and like a large percentage of coaches don't like come back in those studies that and saying like they don't feel adequately trained to know like when to say something. And so I think one, like there's a part on like practitioners like me to be helping educate coaches, right? And also to be saying, hey, like I give free consults. Like if you have a question about an athlete, you're seeing behaviors and you're not sure if you should talk to them, call me and we can have a conversation. And I can tell you like, yeah, that's normal. That's not normal. Here's some questions to ask. Here's how you can structure that. Right. But always I tell coaches to go about like, you know, having the athlete in with you one-on-one, face-to-face, and saying, hey, like, I'm really worried about you. Right. Like I'm noticing you don't seem as happy anymore. Like because often with eating disorders, like other things go along with that, like mental health issues, like sadness and anxiety and stress. Right. Like I'm seeing you're not as engaged with friends anymore. I'm seeing like that you seem really tired in workouts all the time. Like you're not able to complete them. And so it's really taking the focus off food and like looking at these other behaviors and saying like, do you see anything going on? Right. And kind of giving the athlete a chance to say like, yeah, I'm really struggling with food. And if they don't, you know, or if they're really mad, coming back and having another conversation and saying like, hey, I'm really noticing eating disorder signs. Here's the list of resources of somebody who can help you. And I really recommend, like, if we're going to continue working together, and that's a really hard thing, I think, for coaches. And it can also be a hard boundary sometimes for practitioners, is like, kind of like knowing if like kind of an ultimatum has to be put out there of like, if we're going to continue to work together, like you need help, right? Like,
Yeah.
And you need to go see somebody and have an assessment done. And I know that can be very uncomfortable, and it's uncomfortable for me as a practitioner when I'm like, hey, you need a higher level of care, I can't see you, and somebody's like, well, I'm not going, right? But at the same time, there's this, you know, eating disorders have the highest mortality rate of any mental health illness. And so there's like trying to find a balance of like helping somebody and walking with them and trying to help them get ready. And then also saying like, hey, you really can't keep doing this, right? Because like lives really are at stake.
Right.
And unfortunately, a lot of times with eating disorders, things are okay until they're not, right? Like,
Right.
and that's, I think, the hardest and scariest thing. And so that's kind of the approach that I recommend that coaches do, and that they really build a resource of practitioners they trust that they can refer to or that they can call to ask questions about.
Yeah.
I really like those 4 words: higher level of care. It's, you know, I and Jen and I both coach, and I coach a lot of female athletes, and you know, in the past, and I have some that have been open about their struggles before, so that's already out there. But then in the past, I've noticed, either from workouts, or it's a lot of times it's easier to see an Instagram post, and I think you know, you talk to some of the fears, especially as a male coming to a female, and somewhat at a as an authority figure as well. So yeah, I had a lot of qualms about being able to approach another person like that, but I think being able to default to the, you know, I want to refer you to someone else, you know, a higher level of care, something beyond my expertise, beyond, you know, my qualifications. I think that's a much easier way to go about it.
Yeah. Like, Greg, have you, like, whenever you've been in those situations, like, have you noticed, you said like you kind of felt like that tension of being like a male going to like a female and kind of having to address that?
Yeah.
Do you feel like it's been well received when you've had those conversations or had to have those conversations?
You know what, to be honest, I haven't. I mean, I haven't had the conversation because, you know, either I wasn't ready for what the outcome would be, whether it's like, you know, you don't know what you're talking about. Or so yeah, it's definitely, and I hate to say, it's definitely something I avoided, if I, you know, didn't have to. But yeah, it is certainly a scenario that's come up before,
Yeah.
and I do appreciate this talk and having having a better way to approach athletes. So
Yeah. Yeah. And you're totally not alone. Like I said, that's a lot of coaches. And a lot of the coaches I talk to end up being high school coaches. So they kind of get around it by going to a parent instead.
yeah,
But I think also important in this kind of conversation too is like recognizing that it's also it's also a very big deal with male athletes, and it often looks different, right? And right now it's very hard to pinpoint exactly how many male athletes struggle, but like, because the numbers are anywhere from like 3% to 97%, right? But like when you're actually like in an environment with male athletes, like you do see that a lot of them are struggling as well.
Yeah,
and I think that conversation can even be like almost even harder, because they're like, that's not a male problem, that's a female problem.
Well, I think it's harder I mean, at least women lose their period, right? And so that's a big red flag. And so males don't have that red flag. And so I think often it's harder to recognize, it's harder for them to recognize, even because they don't have those hormonal cascades in the same way that women do.
Yeah, it looks different.
Yeah, definitely. I think the Trail Society had a pretty good podcast on that, and they had a male on who talked about some of those same struggles, and he echoed the same thing. It's like there's some women have the signs are a little bit easier to see, and maybe the males like my sex drive is down, or it's a little bit tougher. So, and I think to that point as well, I feel like as a male going to another male athlete, I feel like it would be easier for me to approach another male than I would a female, and maybe it's because I can come at it a different way, and but I think it's an interesting dynamic, going from a male to male or a male to a female. So
yeah, and it's also unfortunate because there's not a ton of male therapists in general, and then there's not a ton of male therapists that actually treat eating disorders. And honestly, too, like a lot of the males that I see don't want to be treated by a male; they want to be treated by a female for their eating disorder.
Interesting.
Oh, that is interesting.
Very interesting.
I think there's like such shame, right? Like, and so sometimes people perceive like females to be more gentle or whatever, like for the shame that they're feeling.
Gotcha.
It's hard to be vulnerable to another male.
Yeah, especially about eating issues. And there's not, like I said, there's not that many that treat them.
Yeah.
It's a hard place to be in.
Yeah.
All right. Just trying to see.
What else you have, Jen?
I don't think I have anything else on that topic. Yeah.
Well, I think another important topic, like within the eating disorder realm, and you might be about to get to this, is like the over exercise, especially when we come to like the trail and ultra running community, right?
Oh, yes.
And like, how do we differentiate what is like pursuing excellence in sport versus like what is disordered? And that is like a really tough line. I contributed to a piece on this in Trail Runner a few years ago, and there are lots of very unhappy people and messages that I got afterwards.
Go figure.
And man, I think, really when, like, if you're not fueling enough to like what you're doing, like, and you're saying, this is my goal, like my goal is to run X amount and to complete this race, and then you're not fueling adequately to do that, then there's something out of line. That's not true. Like, that's not why you're running as much as you're running, right? Like, that's not, if you're like running and you've got to run to make up for all the food you've eaten or for anything you've eaten, right? Like, then that's also not appropriately a way to use running. Like, if you're using it because I can't feel the emotions I'm feeling, like that also isn't an appropriate way to use it. If you are, like I always talk to athletes, if you are going rogue off the training plan that your coach has made and you're saying, yeah, no, my coach doesn't really know what they're talking about. I need to exercise at a high intensity and I need to do extra because they're not going to get me where I want, you know, and that could be as simple as I'm doing the crunches while I'm watching TV. I'm going to add a couple extra miles. Like, that also is probably inappropriate, and we need to explore like why you're doing that, because you're paying somebody or you've got a coach and you're saying like, I'm trusting you to get me here, and then you're not doing it, right? And so I think all of those things, right? Like, and really when I have athletes coming in with over exercise, we like kind of go through, I've got this list that's from a book where she's written about treating athletes and eating disorders. And we kind of like look at the list and we say like, this is what healthy exercise is, like like my value, you know, is like outside of exercise, and I still have worth and value as a person, even if I didn't compete. And like, it's unhealthy when I don't have worth and value. And we kind of go through a list of those things and kind of distinguish like, what's kind of fueling this? Like, is it really athletic excellence, or is it like anxiety and fear and unhealthy behaviors? And unfortunately, there's a lot of, I think, lines, and there's a lot of permissive behavior, especially like within the longer distance running communities.
Yeah. Well, and there's also, like we've talked about this a lot, Greg and I, just over racing also. Yeah. And so that's an extension of over exercising for sure. When you just race way too often, and because we really don't know the long-term effects on our body of just long races, just over and over without giving ample time for recovery.
So
that's also a concern for sure.
Or somebody who refuses to take like a rest day, right? Or you know,
Monday is rest day. Like I'm like, everybody has Monday is a rest day.
Or, you know, even within this,
you're not be going and doing anything.
Looking at, you know, like we've talked about restrictive eating, but I think also within the distance community is a higher rate of binge eating. And so, you know, people will go out and they'll go for runs for like hours in the morning, and they won't eat breakfast before they go, and they won't feel adequately while they're there, and they won't feel adequately afterwards. And then they end up binge eating at night. And then they come into my office and they're like, well, you've got to help me. I've got an overeating problem, right? And I'm like, actually, you need to eat more. Like, yeah, you know, I think that ties in with that over exercise, like, and not fueling appropriately, and then seeing these signs. And so those are just things that I look out for when people come in, that I always assess about their exercise. And here's the thing, like, as a practitioner, I don't like, people tend to withhold from me, so they might not as much withhold from you guys as coaches, but like, I have to ask like nitty gritty questions. I'm like, well, how much are you exercising? They're like, oh, like, you know, I'm like, well, okay, like 30 minutes on what? And 30 minutes, you know, like, and ask very specific questions in order to get a complete picture, because oftentimes people will leave things out.
It's usually on Strava.
Yes, Strava is a great tool for tracking.
As long as they don't start hiding it from you on Strava. Then, yeah.
And I mean, you know, this is also, like, I've had athletes tell me before, you know, like, oh, like, I'm not exercising that much. And because they have Stravas or they have Garmin's, right? Especially their Garmin's, if they wear it all day, and then I pull it up and I'm like, where were you walking? Like, what were you doing?
Yeah, 20,000 steps today, and you weren't working out.
Yeah. And they're like, well, I was just walking, you know? And so I think if you're questioning if somebody's having behaviors, like really trying to do some detective work, Because I mean, that's the whole thing about eating disorders, right? They thrive in secret. Like they can't exist like in communities and in honesty and in light. And so they thrive in secrecy. And so like having to ask questions that are uncomfortable to not be truthful about is really the way you kind of get down to what's actually going on when somebody does have an eating disorder and what exactly they are doing.
That's a good point. I hadn't really thought about, I haven't given a whole lot of thought to the over exercising part of it. But yeah, that's a big part of it.
Because, people can also have disordered behaviors without classifying as an eating disorder, right? And so it is very common because it is like societally acceptable to be like, well, I ate dinner and I feel uncomfortable, right? And so instead of sitting with that discomfort and asking myself, like, what is really going on emotionally with me that I'm kind of projecting onto this feeling of discomfort, of being full, or of what I ate, it's very acceptable to be like, well, I could go for a 30-minute walk, or I could go do crunches, or I could go do X, Y, and Z, right? And that's actually like compensating for what you ate, and you're creating a pattern that is could be harmless, right? But could not be.
Right. And so, well, when you have those conversations, I mean, what if they're just not, if they're not ready and they just shut you out? Do you continue to try to push that? Do you give it a little time? You just kind of.
Yeah, that's really hard. Like, I don't think every conversation we have with that individual should keep coming, like, should automatically be like, hey, like, you still have this problem, right? But I do think, like, when we say that we care about people, like, caring about people is at times holding them accountable to really difficult things. And so if they're going to make a choice to say like, hey, I still want to be friends, and I still want to be coached, and I still want to be working out together, like for me, like when I think about it just as a friendship perspective, I'm like, that is not, it's not my responsibility, but part of is my responsibility for somebody I care about to say like, I care about you too much to keep ignoring this. Like, I'm going to keep telling you this, even if you're not ready. Right.
Yeah.
Because eating disorders are extremely oftentimes resistant, right? And people aren't ready until they're ready. But like I said, I see people in my office all the time, and I ask them, like, when are you going to take this seriously? Like, when are you going to commit to recovery? Like, what's going to be the tipping point? Unfortunately, for a lot of people, the answer I hear the most often is, I'm going to have to pass out and hit my head really badly. And I'm like, at that point, like, we are talking like, that's really scary. And we have to remember that when we're having these conversations with individuals who are really deeply in eating disorders, that their brain has changed. And so they can't think correctly. They don't have enough calories. They don't have enough fat on their body. They're not thinking correctly because they're not nourished enough to think correctly. Right.
Right.
And so, my big soapbox to parents of athletes, right, is like, as a parent, like, you have to be the advocate. I see so often, and I understand it's so difficult for parents, like, to see their children struggling, and to be the parent that's like having fights with their kid at home about food all the time. But what happens is the kid is not invested, and the tension at home becomes so much. And it's, if they're an athlete and they start to perform not as well, because often that happens, then they're mad. And they're saying this is ruining their athletic career. And then parents let them tap out of therapy. And so as to the parents out there, like, you've got to be the advocate, even when it's hard. Like, you've got to be the one that sticks to therapy and says, you've got to go, right? Because we're talking about life and death.
Yeah, for sure. All right. Greg, you have anything?
Well, I don't think I have any other questions, although we could end on a lighter note that Hailey, if you weren't aware, she is signed up to do the 18-miler at Rambo and the Brambles.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
We'll see how that goes.
That's a fun course. It's kind of it's like a mini hill country.
Fun.
It's like, it's not quite as much elevation as the hill country, but the trail reminds me of just, that type of trail. It was fun the day I went out there and ran it.
Fun. Yeah, I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah.
And hopefully it'll be nice and warm that day.
Hopefully not too warm.
So what on a related note, as you you obviously you have your profession, and you're balancing your own training as an endurance athlete and as a parent. How do you find all that balance?
Gosh, it's so hard. Well, I cut back at work, so I'm only working 2 days a week now. Before I was working 5. So, but like owning my own business, I have that flexibility. So that's been super, super nice. And then I do a lot of running.
Stroller runs.
And it's like kind of miserable, but also I'm just like, I'm not sacrificing any more sleep to not do it. So yeah. But yeah, so it's been an interesting trying to balance it. But I think every day just looks different, like just trying to go with what the day is and not be overly attached to like my training plan. Like I would love to complete it exactly how it is, but at the same time I'm like, it is what it is.
Yeah. Life happens.
Yeah.
Life happens.
Yeah. And I also feel like I'm like, I can run like hardly at all with the stroller, I feel like, and our neighborhood's pretty hilly. And so I'm like, I feel like running 3 miles is like running 10 miles with my stroller.
I have no doubt.
That's almost like wearing a weight vest.
Yes.
Like try to run in, because that adds a lot of extra resistance.
Yeah, it's like pushing 50 pounds of stroller, and I'm like, whew, goodness gracious. So
Cool.
yeah, that's kind of the balance. And and then I'm staying at home most of the time and just watching my baby. So yeah,
that's terrific.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I think it's also important, as we're talking about a lighter note, like in the conversation, anybody I see who comes in to get treatment, who really wants to change, who wants to get better, even if it takes a while, they get better.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Yeah.
And it is possible. And then you can enjoy all the donuts.
Awesome. I'm gonna post the links to your Instagram and also to Grapevine Wellness Center in our show notes. So we really appreciate you coming on. I know Jen's this was a topic near and dear to her and something that she really wanted to talk about. So I'm glad that the timing worked out well. I was like, oh, Hailey already posted about this. She could come on and talk to us. So.
Well, I appreciate it because I don't like to talk about things that I'm not qualified to talk about. So sometimes I'm really hesitant to put some stuff out there, even if it's just for awareness, because
we definitely wanted to broach the topic without trying to be the experts on it. So
and then when people are mad, they can message me.
That's right.
Message me and are mad at me all the time. So.
Send all your mean comments to Hailey, not us.
Yeah,
there you go.
But thank you guys so much for having me on and for talking about this. Like I said, this is like something that is super, like, is a passion of mine, is just to bring education and awareness, and to do that in any kind of space that'll let me talk. But also thank you guys for all that you do with the trail running community. I know we haven't chatted a lot, but I know when I've seen you at Bridgeport, Greg, like just the community you guys have created is just such a wonderful space. And if I didn't live on the other side of the Metroplex, I would come out to join you guys to run sometime.
We're trying to make our way to more rounds on your side. Maybe we'll have a Knob Hills run soon.
Yes.
Yeah.
I was so happy when we moved over here, because I was like, oh my gosh, it's like 10 minutes to Knob Hills, but like that 114, 377
oh my gosh,
is like, it could be 10 minutes or it could be 30 minutes to Knob Hills.
My daughter and son-in-law live in Keller. So, I mean, I would be glad to run at Knob Hills because then I could go stop by and see my grandbaby afterwards.
Yeah, that'd be super fun.
Yeah.
I'm always up for, well, not always. When I have childcare, I'm
Yeah.
up for a run.
We will definitely make that happen.
Yeah.
Thank you guys so much. It was good to talk to you.
Yep.
Thanks for
Thank
coming
you.
on.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye.
Have a
Bye.
good night.